It's not clear that the best room was picked for this. Is that entirely? Okay. Thanks, everyone, for coming. If you're not inside yet, there's extraordinary amount of room. There's just so much room on the floor here. There should be. There's places here. And it's not going to be for more than an hour, so standing might be okay. If your legs are sore, sit. Okay, so I have a lot of slides, and to avoid drowning in complexity, the only thing that you really need to know is that very recently President Obama issued a historic executive order, which is binding on the executive branch, requiring it to incorporate behavioral science in its decisions. So the hope is, whether the goal is to reduce poverty, to increase economic opportunity, to help people get college educations, to help farmers get loans to which they're entitled, to assist small businesses in an economically challenging time, we're going to see some low-cost, potentially very effective innovations. In the United Kingdom, the interest in behavioral science has come from the conservatives, not from the left. There's reason to think that these instruments can cut across ideological differences. There's a very subtle, nice piece of the executive order from the president, which says that the relevant people in the White House have to do annual reports until 2019. That's clever, because it suggests that in the next administration, we're going to see this stuff continuing, unless a subsequent president repeals the executive order, and that's not extremely likely. Okay, so in the United Kingdom from 2010 to now, there's been a behavioral insights team. It was specifically promoted by Prime Minister Cameron, and what it's been doing is conducting a lot of experiments to try to see where there is a public policy problem from which the United Kingdom is suffering. Are there ways of testing using experiments that can help, a little or a lot? Since 2014, the United States has had something similar. Germany has recently set one up. No data yet on what they've produced. I just learned this morning the Netherlands has its own behavioral insights team. Lots of other countries are interested. I think we shouldn't think that a behavioral insights team is a necessary condition for the use of behavioral insights. When I was in the White House, there was a lot of use of behavioral insights. It's in the Affordable Care Act, in the Dodd-Frank statute, in some environmental regulations. And that's extremely important. Those are kind of defining innovations. They don't require behavioral insights teams to get going. Okay, the World Bank, kind of not the most likely source of endorsement of behavioral science. They're pretty standard in their methodology. They devoted their entire 2015 report to behavioral insights, with this very ambitious claim from the president of the World Bank, concluding, after a long list of policy challenges, the promise of this approach is enormous. That's a big word, enormous, and the scope of application extremely wide. Okay, here's the executive order. This is the big deal. A growing body of evidence, says the president, demonstrates that findings from psychology and behavioral economics can be used. The federal government should define its policies and programs to reflect our best understandings of how people react. So when I was in the government, one thing I heard repeatedly, especially from the regulated sector, was we don't hate what you're doing, but we don't understand it. So the thought was to give clarity and specificity and simplicity would be extremely helpful. And that's one thing the president is calling for. Okay, so there's encouragement, and when the president encourages something, that's not just please. They should identify opportunities to help families and businesses get access to programs by streamlining processes. They should improve how information is presented to people by considering how its content affects comprehension. Often government programs don't work very well because the communication is extremely confusing. I think we should see Steve Jobs as the recent decades kind of behavioral science hero, in a clear sense of how to make products interact with people's pre-existing intuitions rather than confounding them. And the government can do that or not. It's better to do that. Okay, identify programs that offer choices and structure how the consider how the presentation structure of those choices can most effectively promote public welfare. And I think the money provision here is consider how the selection and setting of default rules can help. So that's absolutely crucial. Your cell phone and your computers have default settings on them. Chances are that they tend to stick. Default settings tend to stick, and that's true for government programs also. Okay, there are two exclamation points that I put here because this is potentially very important. There's an ongoing process that I'm sure the next president will continue for scrutinizing regulatory requirements on the books, whether they involve the environment or healthcare or transportation. Some of those requirements are dumb. Some of them are too complicated. Some of them impose big cost. The effort is to link the behavioral insights with that. And here's the provision: until 2019, there have to be annual reports. Okay, how did we get here? I have occasional pictures to liven things up. There's one. Okay, from about 1960 to 2000, and this is kind of something I experienced very close hand at the University of Chicago. It's very much in the atmosphere here, I think, also. That at least as a first approximation, you should assume that human beings are rational. That in deciding what they do, you should focus on how they will calculate probabilities and look at expected value. They're responsive to incentives. And there's one Nobel Prize winner whose most important essay, Ronald Coase, says that the initial allocation of the entitlement doesn't matter. So if half of you got a special behavioral science talk Thursday mug, and the other half of you didn't, and then we asked how much would you be willing to pay for the mug, it should be, to get it, you don't have it, sorry. How much are you willing to pay for it? That should be the same amount as you all say if you're asked how much would you demand to give up your mug. Coase theorem has implicit that that's going to be the same. The initial allocation of the entitlement doesn't matter. But unless we have a very unusual group, those of you who initially get the mug are going to demand a lot more to give it up than those of you who don't initially have the mug are willing to pay to get the mug. And that would be true not just for mugs, but also for lottery tickets. And not just true for lottery tickets, but also for rights to protect members of endangered species, for health and safety risks, for the goods that come from an association with a university or an employer or a nation. People will systematically demand more to give it up if they have it by default than they'll demand to get it in the first instance. That's a very large complication for the Nobel Prize winning Coase theorem. It suggests that the legal rule will shape preferences and not merely be a neutral background fact. Okay, another Nobel Prize went to Gary Becker. Late, very great man, and Judge Posner, who's occasionally mentioned as a Nobel Prize candidate, is in this respect mostly a follower of Becker, saying that improving incentives is really the right policy prescription, and that's not wildly wrong, of course, and it suggests a simple engine for thinking about law and public policy. Okay, the behavioral objections starting in the 1970s have these features. People often show present bias. Today and tomorrow matter a whole lot more than next year and the year after. People hate losses. They like losses a lot They dislike losses a lot more than they like corresponding gains. Bill Belichick, after winning the Super Bowl, said, our high, see, he kind of mangled the sentence a little bit, but he got the psychology right. Something like, our high is a lot lower than their low is low, something like that. But he said, well, I've been there, meaning to lose the Super Bowl is a lot more miserable than to win the Super Bowl is thrilling. Okay, entitlements often stick, so mugs, lottery tickets, legal rights, that's called the endowment effect. People don't always do well with probability. They use mental shortcuts. They tend to be unrealistically optimistic. I think this last one's the most important. It seems more mundane than it actually is. People have limited attention, and where they are focusing their mind is absolutely essential, both to what they will do and to their well-being. So a little kind of slogan from Daniel Kahneman, whose first book was called Attention and Effort. His work grew out of attention. It was in the early 1970s. About 4 decades later, he said, nothing in life is as important as you think it is when you're thinking about it, which is emphasizing the centrality of attention to both well-being and action. Okay, to get some particularity here, the availability heuristic means that our judgments about risk will often depend on whether salient examples come to mind. So people get really scared about something where the risk is low because they have a recent event, or they can be complacent about something where the risk is high. Not long ago, I think it's less than a year, many Americans, especially in New York, were really scared about Ebola because of some salient cases, even though at that time more Americans had married Kardashians than had died. Okay. How many of you have seen the invisible gorilla experiment? Okay, most of you. So in a nutshell, this is a little experiment, you can see it on YouTube, where people are supposed to count basketball passes, and there's a gorilla that comes across the screen in the middle, and somewhere between half and 2/3 typically just don't see the gorilla at all. I was one of a group of Harvard faculty members subject to the experiment, and in our group, which was about 35 people, only one person saw the gorilla. And I remember my own reaction when that one person raised his hand. I thought there was some kind of joke. Of course there is no gorilla, but there is. People don't see it. It tells something about attention. I have both a little daughter who's 3 years old. She probably would see the gorilla. I have a big daughter who's in her mid-20s. When I told her just what I told you, then I showed her the video on YouTube, and I said, and she looked at me right after. She said, "Where was the gorilla?" I think that's profound because it suggests that even if you're specifically told about the thing that would not ordinarily grab your attention, if you're focused elsewhere, you won't see it. That's relevant to a lot of what's being done in the US and the UK, where the idea is to focus people's attention where it would otherwise be missing. Okay, loss aversion. The University of Chicago's people say incentives matter. That sounds right. If you promise teachers that if their students at the end of the year get better math scores, they'll get a bonus, that has basically no effect on the students' math scores. Very mixed evidence. But if you give teachers some money up front and you tell them if the students' math scores don't increase, they're going to have to give the money back, very large effects. People hate the idea of losses. Golfers do better putting for par than they do for putting for birdie. And these are professional golfers where there's a lot of money on the line. If professional golfers putted as well for birdie as they do for par, they'd make significantly more money in the course of a year. It's loss aversion. The reference point is set by par, and a birdie is a gain, a bogey is a loss, and people fight like tigers, so to speak, to avoid losses. Okay, that has policy implications. In the District of Columbia, there was a recent effort to discourage waste by saying if you bring your own bag, you're going to get a dime. No one brought their own bag. then, or dime or nickel. Then there was a new policy that said if you want to use one of our bags, you have to pay a nickel. Had very significant effects, even though a nickel is, very close to nothing. Okay, the behavioral claims in the 2000s, default rules really matter. Incentives may not always matter much. Choice architecture is really important, where the idea is that there is a choice architecture behind all our choices. When you get a credit card statement, there's an architecture there that gives you options and tells you things. The architecture could be different. It has a very large impact on what people do, the nature of the architecture. If candy bars, and I'm vulnerable to this myself, I know, because of one of the vending machines, if they're in green wrappers, people who don't want to eat extremely high calorie candy bars, I'm assuming there is such a thing, they go for the green ones, even if it's pure milk chocolate. If people sign forms at the beginning, there's evidence that they're less likely to lie than if they sign forms at the end. Google recently choice architected its cafeteria in a way that didn't eliminate choices, but made the healthy choices more visible and salient and attention-grabbing. And apparently it's had significant effects. In fact, there's a new book by one of Google's prime decision makers here. I think it's called Work Rules or something. And he's big on choice architecture as an instrument that can be helpful in the workplace. Okay, simplicity is really important. Attention matters greatly. And here's a psychological finding that I first heard, actually, just a few days ago at the White House event. Never heard it before. It was from Kahneman, who was speaking. He said this stuff is reminiscent of some very old psychological work, which shows that there are two ways to get people to change their behavior. One is to push them a little bit, and another is to remove the resistance they're already facing. Now, from the standpoint of standard behavioral thinking, they're the same. They're both incentives, yes? But the psychological finding, the empirical finding, is other things being equal, if you remove resistance that people are already facing, that has more of an impact than a push. I think that's a profoundly important finding. It helps account for a lot of the behavioral work. It has implications for lawyers. If you want to move in the direction of a result, to suggest that the source of resistance to the result can be made smaller or eliminated, that's often, the most effective thing to do. Okay. Okay. Now we're going to talk about what a nudge is. The little elephant's being nudged. I like to think that the little elephant has freedom of choice. If it wants to stay on the road, it can. That may be underplaying the evident size and determination of the big elephant, but let's go with it. Okay, here's a kind of canonical nudge, a GPS, in the sense that it fully maintains freedom of choice, but it steers people in a direction that they have said they want to go. So what's noteworthy about a GPS is it's choice preserving. It doesn't eliminate people's freedom of action. It doesn't impose any material effect on them. And it helps steer them in the direction that they want to go. If they don't like it, they want to go the scenic route or they want to go the route that's more familiar, you can completely do that. It's just a nudge. Okay, that's a famous nudge. This is my only scandalous slide. This is a urinal. Maybe Harvard should have urinals like this. Probably it would help. Not the worst problem in the world, but could be a little net benefit. That's not a real fly. It's a painted fly in the airport in the Netherlands. And the reason the fly was painted there was to reduce spillage. And the result of the mere painting of the fly, essentially costless, was to reduce spillage by 44%. Apparently, once seeing the fly, men can't help but aim at it. And there are variations. I can announce to those of you who don't know, some of you do, there are variations on this all over the world now. Like soccer goal or a basketball. Okay, here's a nudge that went wrong. I don't know how good I don't know how good your German is. That didn't work so well. Okay, automatic enrollment and savings. This is, I think, a terrifically impressive slide. It's a demonstration that automatic enrollment in savings plans has massive effects in increasing participation rates at every place on the income distribution. And the largest impact is on people who are not making a lot of money. Now, there's a lot to be pondered in this slide, but let's give the simple and optimistic view, where the simple and optimistic view is that all over the United States, if people are simply enrolled automatically in savings plans with easy opt-out, they're going to have a lot more comfortable retirements, especially people at the low end of the income distribution who might otherwise be penniless or close to it. They're going to accumulate not a fortune, but something that's at least a foundation for a decent life. Okay, so automatic enrollment and the environment. I think the White House announcement indicated the government's going to go in this direction. If you have double-sided printing by default, you'll save a lot of paper, you'll save money, and it's environmentally good. Not fantastic, but good. I confess I've known about this finding for at least a year and worked with it. Guess whether my printer has double-sided default? No. I want double-sided default. I want double-sided printing 80% of the time, so I'd like that default, but it's too confusing to figure out how to change it. Institutions that would, for me, maybe you can figure it out. For institutions, it's an easy winner. Here's something that has a larger impact. In Germany, this is a randomized test of a nudge with about 40,000 households, where the finding is if people are automatically enrolled in green energy, subject to easy opt-out, you have a 10-fold increase in actual participation in green energy. That's very large, considering the fact that opt-in is essentially costless and so is opt-out. You have a huge environmental benefit from switching the default rule. Now, one thing to ask about that is what are the relevant populations in opt-in, opt-out conditions? What are they doing? Not amazingly, under opt-in, the best predictor of whether people are going to go green is whether they're in the Green Party. That's a very good predictor. That's not amazing. But kind of amazing, under opt-out, whether they're in the Green Party has no predictive power about whether they're going to go green. So it goes from being a very strong causal factor to have it being not a causal factor at all. You might worry, I think I would worry, that opt-out is kind of tricking people. And so people are just saying, yeah, whatever, and they're going for more expensive energy without actually consenting. But the data suggests that under opt-out in Germany, people are consciously aware that they're spending more money and they're going green. They're just okay with it. That might be because of conscience. And under opt-out, conscience is triggered. People say, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be environmentally a bad citizen. Okay, so a nudge is a feature of the social environment that affects people's choices without imposing coercion or any kind of material incentive. So I think the one that is the kind of simplest, but the one that I think deserves right now the most attention is the one at the bottom. Reminders. Law professor humor. Okay, so the idea is that often people don't take advantage of something or don't do something because it's attention. So I was playing squash with a doctor in New York who was the chair of a not trivial hospital department in the city. And I said, do you have a problem with non-compliance with medical stuff? Like people don't take medicines who should be. And it was as if I was asking him, you know, have the Washington Nationals have a disappointing head of the season? I mean, yeah. And so we talked about it a little bit, and he said, you know, one thing is we don't really have a problem anymore with people missing their appointments. They don't miss doctor's appointments because we send text messages to them. So what if we reminded people periodically about their medical requirements? His judgment was that could kind of instantly make a huge dent in a problem which results in a lot of serious health conditions. Okay, so that's a tale. It's a little embarrassing picture, but people told me I should put it in. So, so that was a little bit of an amazing event for me. I was privileged really to be a colleague of the president's at the University of Chicago for over a decade, so I know him. But when you're working in the White House, you know, you don't have casual conversations with the president very often. He's your boss. But that conversation happened between the White House and the old executive office building, the Eisenhower building. One time the government was, I don't remember whether it was in the midst of a shutdown or it was about to be facing a shutdown. And he kind of had a lot on his mind. And to my amazement, I heard a voice from about 10 feet away calling out my name. And I turned around and it was the president. And what he wanted to talk about in that conversation was our regulatory system and whether it was imposing excessive costs and whether there was something we could do that would be quite aggressive to engage in simplification and increase simplification, decrease cost, eliminate requirements on people. And that conversation actually helped spur a meeting which led to the regulatory look back, to which I referred, where the government's now trying to institutionalize behavioral science. So that's a tale. Okay, here's a better tale, I think, less personal, but better, which is that the US has had a problem with poor children who are eligible for school meals not taking advantage of what the law gives them a right to. Parents aren't signing them up, at least not in sufficiently large numbers. Why is that? It might be that they are busy. It might be that they're inattentive. It might be that they're scared. It might be just the form is not fun to fill out. So those are possibilities. Congress said we're going to have something called direct certification, which means that if the school or the locality knows the people are eligible, then they're automatically in. And that's resulted in over 12 million children, last count, getting meals to which they're entitled. Okay, Oregon, you might have seen recently, said we're going to have automatic enrollment of eligible citizens as voters. So you're a voter by default. Oregon expects that with that little, essentially costless innovation, hundreds of thousands of citizens of Oregon will be voters, subject to opt-out. A number of European nations do the same thing. That could, with one super simple change, dramatically cut into the problem of people who aren't registered, find registration complex and daunting. The Affordable Care Act has a provision, it hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but it says as of this year, what's anticipated by regulation, you need the regulation first, is that employers with more than 200 employees will automatically enroll people in health care, subject to opt-out if, for example, their spouse already has coverage. That should cut pretty quickly the challenge that a number of people face of registering on their own for health insurance. Through one simple nudge, you're going to get significant numbers of people into the system. And I hope you're thinking now, this seems to me if we could have one big policy shift in the next 30 years, thinking where there are serious policy challenges that result in people suffering in terms of, acute deprivation or at least lacking opportunities from which they'd benefit immensely, even if they're not acutely suffering, or problems of unjustified inequality or unaddressed discrimination. How could we use default rules? That's the most aggressive, automaticity, or if not default rules, simplification and ease as a way of cutting into those problems. Well, what nations are finding is time and time again, scrutinizing exactly that question, where is complexity or requirement making a problem not solved, that's an engine for creativity. Okay, I have a slogan for you. Plate, not pyramid. Doesn't sound like a great slogan. Okay, that's the food pyramid from a long time ago. There's a person, gender unclear, trying to march to the top of a pyramid. The gender is ambiguous, and no shoes. Those are the only things we know about that person. The person's marching to the top of a pyramid, a little white triangle. Imagine you're a student or a teacher or a parent trying to figure out what the United States Department of Agriculture is telling you. This is a nudge, by the way. Not a good one, but it's a nudge. You're supposed to go to that triangle. What is that? Is that thinness? Is that death? Where are you walking? If you look at the bottom, that's the foods. They're organized by color. Does anyone know what that blue one is connoting, or the green, what they're connoting? I kind of do this stuff. I have no idea what that's connoting. Do you recognize the foods? Are those recognizable as things that you might encounter in the next week? I only recognize one thing there. If you look on the bottom right, that's clearly a shoe. The government say you should eat your shoe. Okay, so this is not helpful. As part of the First Lady's Let's Move initiative, the department got rid of the food pyramid and replaced it with the food plate. It's a very good question how to make this ideal, if it isn't. But notice, if you would, it basically gives one message, loud and clear. Make your plate half fruits and vegetables, and then you're most of the way there. That's the big instruction. Now, the plate, not pyramid, I had a big picture of this up in my office in the government. And the reason it seemed to me helpful was that so many times a private or public institution does less well than it can because it's presenting people with a pyramid rather than a plate. In other words, they're resisting the suggestion not because they don't like it, but because they don't understand it. I had a friend involved in a complicated international negotiation, not involving Russia, not involving Syria, not involving the Middle East, but an important one with a real country in which the United States has an interest. And before the president was to go there, there was an absence of clear, as they're called, deliverables. The United States and the country didn't have anything to announce. And that wasn't good, because if the president's time is being used, it's kind of owed that there's something that comes of it. And a friend went to the country to engage in negotiation under pretty dismal circumstances. And I asked with trepidation after the negotiation, how did it go? And the response was, great. Just a stunning surprise. And I said, how could that be? And the response was, plate, not pyramid. And I was kind of only 1/5 toward understanding what that meant. But what was spelled out was, plate, not pyramid, a little slogan among my little group in the government. The response was, the reason things weren't going well is the other nation had no idea what particularly the United States wanted. We presented them with something like the pyramid. Once the United States said, here are 9 things we want, the nation said, oh, 6 of those are great. Let's talk about the other 3, but check, 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 check to the 6. So I think that's very, at least clarifying for me, in government and subsequently, often in one's lawyer's capacity or one's institutional capacity, the fact that people are not doing what's sought or not interested in talking about it, they just don't know what it is. Okay? Okay, Smart Cafeteria, pioneered by food psychologist Brian Wansink at Cornell, who basically is organizing cafeterias so that healthy foods are more accessible, having a very large impact on health. Okay, in 2010, the Federal Reserve Board adopted a simple nudge which says banks can't automatically enroll people into overdraft protection, so-called. So if you're not in an overdraft protection program, that's the Fed's doing. And you should be happy about that, probably. And the reason is if you're in overdraft protection, you can take out a very high interest loan. That's not ideal. What the Fed said is you can go in to the program if you want, but you can't be defaulted in. And that's had significant effects in preventing inadvertent incurring of very high charges for overdraft. Okay, the president's budget is big 2010 and subsequently big on automatic enrollment in pension plans. Our Consumer Bureau has a mantra, know before you owe. And clear, simple disclosure is one of the things it's most keenly interested in. The idea is that consumers shouldn't be taking out loans that they don't understand. And its judgment is that a lot of severe economic difficulty people get themselves into is because there isn't compliance between the know before you owe stricture. Okay, I think I'm going to tell you just one more thing and then go to questions that involves a behaviorally informed initiative. It's kind of a stunning chart. It says it's probably going to be more stunning after the EPA gets done with its truck rules. But look at the standards for US trucks in terms of US automobiles, light duty vehicles between now and 2025. The Prius is now, around 50 miles per gallon? The average in the United States is going up over 50 by 2025. That's a very ambitious anti-pollution and energy security initiative. Okay, I hope you're wondering, is that a good policy? Because that's a good thing to worry about, and we'll get to it in a moment. Okay, do nudges work? Automatic enrollment has a much bigger effect in Denmark than significant tax incentives. Now, as a longtime University of Chicago guy, I can't believe I uttered that sentence. It's startling on two counts. Significant tax incentives for savings have only modest effects. Maybe because of present bias, maybe because of inertia, maybe because of lack of attention. Automatic enrollment has huge effects. In what other areas are we mistakenly focusing on incentives rather than automaticity? Simplification of the financial aid form, in which there have been recent developments from the Department of Education, has the same effect in increasing student attendance of college as several $1,000s in an increase in the subsidy. Government can do two things, give everyone several $1,000s more, or make the form simpler. Form simpler is better, right? There's a little company called O-Power, not so little actually anymore, which informs people about their energy use and how it compares to that of their peers. The result of that little form has been to decrease energy use comparably to an 8 to 20% spike in the short-term cost of electricity. That's a pretty significant spike, which suggests if people are informed that their own behavior is outlier behavior, that can often be an instrument of policy reform. Okay, here's some evidence from the social and behavioral science team just released. A behaviorally informed email campaign to increase savings by service members, basically just emailing them something clear and simple, nearly doubled enrollment in federal savings plan. Lower income students were reminded to complete some pre-matriculation tasks That increased college enrollment by 5.7 percentage points. That's a very large effect. There's a book called The 160 Character Solution. It's really good. It's about increasing educational achievement, basically through text messages. Okay, here's a big one. An outrage letter to farmers produced a 22% increase in the proportion of farmers who ultimately obtained loans. A lot of farmers in the United States are struggling. They wouldn't struggle so much if they got loans. They don't know they're available. This can help. I'll tell you something that I found very poignant. It kind of got to me emotionally. At the White House event, someone from the Department of Defense said, there's one thing we can do for our soldiers, which is make it so that they don't have to worry about their families. And her job is to ensure that Americans who are separated from their spouses or kids can rest assured that if something bad happens, the government is going to help them. And she said, the woman in charge of this said, we have great programs. So if a child is suffering from mental illness, or if there's some terrible problem a military family is facing, we're there for them. But they don't take advantage of our services. And what she said is now we're working with this stuff to try to figure out how to help them. Okay, is this small stuff? The magnitude of the results is often significant. The Paperwork Reduction Act, which I encourage some of you to investigate, it could be an economic opportunity act. I was kind of in charge of overseeing the Paperwork Reduction Act. There's a lot more to be done with it. Okay, I think I'm going to jump ahead to talk about two dilemmas and new directions. Okay, here's one. Default rules might be disturbing in the sense that someone might choose them whom one doesn't trust or who is ignorant, or you might think that they are too crude to fit diverse situations. So if there's a default rule chosen by the dean with respect to your whatever, athletic something, it might be some of you would find yourselves in an athletic something that doesn't fit what you like and want. That's a problem. So you might think more desirable than a default rule is often active choosing, which is actually a form of choice architecture, which I think we haven't thought enough about, where active choosing could be just asking people, do you want X or Y? Or it could be instead requiring people to choose as a precondition for getting something. So you might say, look, if you're going to get a driver's license, you have to say whether you want to be an organ donor. Or you might say, if you're going to get a driver's license, at least you're going to be asked whether you want to be an organ donor. One is required choice, the other is prompted choice. The evidence is that this can have a massive effect on behavior, on outcomes for people, partly because it triggers attention, as default rules don't. The other idea is, in the face of some challenges to designing good default rules, is can we personalize them? Could we say that a certain percentage of people in this room ought to have certain defaults with respect to your relationship with Harvard? But that's not 100%. What we know about other percentages is that a default term in a certain way with respect to whatever just doesn't fit your circumstances. Personalization might be scary from the standpoint of privacy. My own data suggests that at least Harvard students are pretty upbeat about personalized default rules. Americans generally more nervous, but I think we're going to see it as the wave of the future. The Pandoraization of relationships, let's call it. Well, with Pandora, they know from one thing that if you like, Taylor Swift, then you're going to probably like a lot of Taylor Swift songs, and no one really sounds like Taylor Swift, but if in the fullness of time there is someone who does, then they'll be in there too. And that is something I think we're going to see a lot more. It raises privacy challenges. Okay. I mentioned the energy increases in fuel efficiency. Okay, is that justified? You might think people can choose a Prius if they want. Why is the government forcing higher levels of fuel efficiency? You might think because of the environmental and national security benefits, and that's part of the picture. But to justify the fuel economy standards on the cost-benefit figures, you need to talk about consumer savings. That dominates the numbers. If that went by, let me put it in bold letters, the costs of the fuel efficiency standards are significantly higher than the benefits in terms of environmental and energy security benefits, significantly higher. If you include the consumer savings, then the requirements are well justified. You have to include the consumer savings to make the existing requirements justified. Is it fair to include the consumer savings? Why wouldn't we say people buy what they want? They don't want the Prius. They want a different kind of car. Why is the government driving the market in the direction of greater fuel efficiency? The government said this, there's some behavioral problems with consumer choices. There may be present bias. There may be loss aversion. There may be an absence of salience. So it's a behavioral argument. Okay, if you're poor and struggling with a financial problem, and then you take an IQ test, the effects on your performance are equivalent to having no sleep the night before. It's as if your IQ drops by 8 or 9 points. So people who have serious economic challenges in the United States do not have lower IQs than people who don't. But if you ask people who are doing well to figure out how they would solve an economic challenge, like they need to come up with $2,000, and then give them an IQ test, they do fine. If you ask poor people how they'd come up with $2,000 and then give them an IQ test, they do not do fine. That suggests that the problem of poverty is in large part, not sure whether in large part's the precise words, but the problem of poverty is partly a problem of cognitive load, which means that if you're struggling all the time to think about how to make ends meet, then to solve a lot of other problems in your life isn't easy. It's a little like if you're super busy or sick or in love, your mind's just on that. And that doesn't leave a lot of time for other stuff. Okay, which leads up to a persistent problem of take-up and how people might be nudged to benefit from programs which are available for them. The imposition of requirements on people who are struggling may end up being counterproductive. Okay, here's a great quotation. I think this is maybe the best lawyer's quotation of all time from a poet. To generalize is to be an idiot. To particularize is the alone distinction of merit. General knowledges are those knowledges that idiots possess. Now, we have to be a little careful with this because it will doubtless have occurred to you that those are generalizations. Yes? So it's kind of self-defeating. But with respect to many issues, I think lawyers and others get trapped by abstraction. And in the evaluation of behavioral science initiatives, it's good to be particularized. But here's an even better concluding note from maybe an even better poet, Blake and Yeats. Hard to rank them. Yeats ranks with Blake. Do not wait to strike till the iron is hot, but make it hot by striking. Thanks. So we have much time for questions. And if you're leaving because you have a 1 o'clock class, so do I. And I'm sticking around. Yeah.
Is there been any studies on whether it requires more effort to opt in than to opt out? You understand the question?
Yeah, good. I hear the question, whether opting in and opting out, whether there's a disparate level of effort to do one or the other. I think the first cut answer is it just depends on what the requirement is. And if it's a, send an email, it should be the same. You could get, you could trigger emotions that would lead to an asymmetry. Or you could give, or you could give an information signal from the default rule that could create an asymmetry. I'll give you an example. I have some data of my own, it's survey data, that suggests if people are asked whether they want to opt into a green energy program, they're not doing that doesn't make them as guilty as they're opting out of a green energy program does make them feel guilty. So that's an asymmetry. And here's another asymmetry I think that is super interesting and kind of surprising. If people are not automatically enrolled in a savings plan, they don't think the employer has given them any information about what they ought to be doing. They regard that as fully neutral. But if people are automatically enrolled in a savings plan, they think their employer has told them that that's the sensible thing to do. Now, the reason that I think is intriguing is that one thing some people, including yours truly, have said is that the default rule has a signal in it. It's like, it has a little lesson. So if Harvard automatically enrolls you in something subject to opt-out, it's probably telling you that's a good idea, and you'll hear that. Now, you might think Harvard is wrong for me, but at least you have a signal. But non-enrollment is, at least in the savings context, not taken as a signal. So it does have a neutrality. And that suggests, in a way, it's easier to, on that dimension, it's easier to opt in because you're not counteracting what someone seems to have been told you. Whereas if you're opting out, you're thinking, you don't have me right.
Could you talk about some of the effects of this stuff on corporations, regulation of corporations?
Okay, I'll give you one example that comes to mind, which is an early nudge before people were talking much about behavioral science, was to say, the EPA did this, to say that if there are toxic releases, you have to report it to the United States, and there's going to be something called a toxic release inventory. The reason for the toxic release inventory was if there were corporate acts that led to toxic releases, Americans should know about that so that there can be maybe a legislative response. What was not anticipated was the toxic release inventory would be a terrifically successful environmental program. Toxic releases went down significantly. This was not a program, it was a bookkeeping and information gathering program. It wasn't an environmentally substantive program, but it turned out to be one of the most successful of the latter because corporations didn't want to be listed as one of the top 10 polluters in Colorado. So there's an idea, there's one slide I bypassed, but it bears directly on your question. Something worth looking at called the Open Government Partnership. It was born basically in the United States. The current UN ambassador didn't have nothing to do with it, let's put it that way. And what it does is it puts a large number of nations, now I think over 60, in a partnership by which they generate, including the United States, national action plans, which are designed to promote transparency. And a lot of the provisions of the action plans are actually directed at corporations. Now, you might think that it's a great question, and I don't know of any full analysis. You might think that individuals suffer from or benefit from whatever, present bias, optimistic bias, heuristics. To what extent do corporations suffer from the same things? To some extent, undoubtedly, but it may be that their institutional position and the market pressure reduces those things, though there is some evidence suggesting that entrepreneurs definitely suffer from optimistic bias or benefit from. They have optimistic bias.
You talked a lot about countries that are doing this, and then you mentioned Oregon as a state. So are there any cities that have implemented programs like this across the country?
Yes. So the Behavioral Insights team in the UK now has an office in Brooklyn. And they are working with a number of states to export their methodology. There are people in cities that are either incipiently or now up to speed with their own behavioral insights group. I know some of our largest cities are hiring people. They may have law degrees, they may have some sort of master's degrees that can actually help them with this. I mean, there's so many challenges that cities face that are at the intersection of law and policy. Like, just one little example is, you want the system of emergency calls into Boston or New York or San Francisco, that should be a functional system. And functional means that the people who are calling actually need help and they get help. But undoubtedly, in some cities, people are calling who don't need help and they're just clogging the system. And some people who need help aren't getting it quickly enough. What can be done about that? It'd be fantastic if we could answer that. Maybe you could save dozens of lives in 2016.
So when you nudge people, ideally you don't want them to just make a decision. You want them to make a good or even an optimal decision. And that's not necessarily something that default rules could always do. So for example, for savings plans or retirement saving, people could opt into a retirement plan and still be under saving and still be making a suboptimal choice. So how do you use things of behavioral economics to actually not only just to go beyond just default rules and actually encourage people to make the optimal decision, not just a decision?
Okay, so great. So some default rules end up putting people in an optimal position even if they have not made an active decision. So one view is the focus should be on people's welfare, and to give them the power to make their own decisions is very important because the government might be making a mistake, but it's not necessary that they be making a decision. So then the question is, how can you design a default rule which will be very good for the relevant population, both in terms of participation and in terms of savings rates? And you can think of this example as a metaphor for a zillion questions. And I'll tell you what I understand to be Harvard's own answer, which is a good one. For all employees of Harvard, I think, or at least for faculty, I think all, you're automatically enrolled in a savings plan. What savings plan are you enrolled in? It's one that suits your demographic, where I think demographic is defined in terms of age. And so there's a group of people who really know what they're doing about retirement, and they default you into something that suits your situation. Now, in terms of participation rates, it gets everyone into the system. In terms of contribution rates, it has automatic escalation. So you start out low, and then as you get your salary goes up, you get higher rates of participation. And the theory is that that's well suited to people's needs, and it's not going to take a significant damaging chunk out of their current income. Now, if you're thinking about this example, who are those experts? Do they know what they're doing? Is it optimal? Those may not have great answers, and in situations where they don't, you might want to inform people and to have active choosing. So here's something that bears directly on your question, something I haven't talked about. There's some very, very good German social scientists who are interested in a concept called boosts. What they want to do is boost people's own capacity to make good decisions, and they think of nudges as not doing that. Now, I would say boosts are a kind of nudge, but that's more semantic. Nothing turns on it. The idea of equipping people, even through something very simple like the food plate, to make, you may see the food plate and say, I want all meat. I don't want any fruit or vegetable this week. Fine, at least you were boosted. And so that might be the right way to go. I'm afraid we've run out of time, and I have people down there. Thank you.